I'm Walter S. Gerard, Sunday School Director for New Spirit Baptist Church here in Dallas, Texas, where the Reverend Otis Grimes is pastor. And our Sunday School lesson for today, September the 8th, in the year of our Lord 2024, is Solomon Dedicates the Temple. The reference scriptures for this lesson are taken from the book of 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, the 22nd through the 24th verse, the 37th through the 39th verse, the 46th verse, and the 48th through the A part of the 50th verse. This is lesson 2 in our lesson series, Worship in the Covenant Community. And it's lesson 2 in unit 1 of this lesson series, Leaders Set Worship Example. Unit 1, Leaders Set Worship Example. In last week's lesson, Abram builds an altar. We studied about how Abram, whose name was changed to Abraham by God, was motivated to build an altar for worshiping God because of who God is. Abram knew that the God he worshiped was the one true God, worthy to be praised, and building an altar to do so. This set an example for the spirit of worship that we should all have. In this lesson, King Solomon was also motivated to do something in the spirit of worshiping God because of who God is. King Solomon took it to a whole new level, a whole nother level, as said by some. Now, reading the scriptures from the New International Version of the Bible, 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, the 22nd through the 24th verse, the 37th through the 39th verse, the 46th verse, and the 48th through the A part of the 50th verse, is as follows. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it, as it is today. Moving to the 37th verse. When famine or plague comes to the land, or blight or mildew, locust or grasshoppers, or when an enemy besieges them in any of their cities, whatever disaster or disease may come, and when a prayer or plea is made by any one among your people Israel, being aware of afflictions of their own hearts, and spreading out their hands toward this temple, then hear from heaven, your dwelling place. Forgive and act. Forgive and act. Deal with everyone according to all they do, since you know their hearts, for you alone know every human heart. The 46th verse. When they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to their enemies, who take them captive to their own lands, far or near. And then skipping to the 48th verse. And if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies, who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their ancestors, toward the city you have chosen, and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Forgive all the offenses they have committed against you. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his holy word. The lesson setting for this lesson is after the temple of God had been built. Up until then, the Israelites had been worshiping God in a tent that could be taken to wherever the people traveled to in the land of Canaan. King David, the father of King Solomon, had it in his heart to build a temple for God in which the Israelites could worship him. This pleased God. However, David was a man of war, and he had killed too many people. He had too much blood on his hands, as the Bible puts it. So God said that he would not be the one to build the house of the Lord, but rather his son of his own flesh and blood would be the one to build it. Now, David provided all the material, and Solomon had the temple built. It took 7 years to build it, and it was completed in the year 959 BC. And Solomon called all the people for the dedication of it. He stood in front of the altar of the Lord and raised his hands toward heaven in front of all the people and began to pray. This prayer posture, standing that is, with his hands raised, this prayer posture was common. However, there were others, such as kneeling down and laying flat on the ground. They call it prostrate on the ground. King Solomon began the second longest prayer in the Bible. Only the prayer in Nehemiah, the 9th chapter, and the 5th through the 38th verse is longer. First, he acknowledged that there is no other God like the God of Israel, not in heaven or on earth, and that he keeps his covenant of love with his people, whom Solomon called his servants, those who continue to live according to his will. Solomon then acknowledged that God had kept his promise to King David, Solomon's father, that David's son would build the house of the Lord, and that promise was fulfilled on that day. Then Solomon began to pray about sins that Israel had not yet even committed. Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, and the 15th through the 68th verse list all the punishments God would bring down upon the Israelites if they disobeyed him. And of course, all these Israelites were aware of these scriptures in Deuteronomy. Solomon mentioned some of them in verse 37 of our text. Famine, plague, locusts, grasshoppers, their cities besieged by their enemies, or whatever disaster or disease may come upon them. Solomon prayed that when God punished the Israelites like this, if any one of them who was aware of the afflictions of their own heart, in other words, whatever sins they themselves were guilty of or were on their consciences, if any one of them would spread their hands toward the temple and pray, that God would hear their prayer all the way up in heaven. And then he would forgive them. And finally, he would restore them according to what was in their hearts. God knows who's for real about repenting and who's just trying to get out of whatever punishment they might be receiving at the time. He alone knows what's in everybody's heart. No use trying to fool him. It can't be done. In verse 46, Solomon addresses those who would be taken as captives to foreign lands by their enemies because of sin. And that did indeed happen when the Babylonians destroyed Israel and took the people to Babylon into captivity. Solomon doesn't say if they sin, but when they sin. And that's because there is no one who does not sin. He says that if they turn back to God with all their heart and soul in their captivity and pray toward the land of Israel and toward Jerusalem and the temple that he, Solomon, had built, then that he, God, would hear their prayer all the way up in heaven and heed their cause. In other words, pay attention to what they're pleading for. Then, of course, forgive them for all the sins they have committed against him, as we see in the last verse of our written text, the A part of verse 50. We see in this lesson that God punishes sin no matter who commits it, but his punishment is only as severe as the sin calls for. Even though we worship him, we sometimes give in to the weakness of the flesh, and that's sin. Although all sin is considered as unrighteousness by God, he considers some more abominable than others. He destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah because the people's sin was so great that he came down from heaven to see for himself. And he punished Moses by just not allowing him to enter the promised land for being disobedient. When we find ourselves being punished by God, we need to ask for forgiveness and mean it. Then he'll forgive us if we continue to worship him. Our worship should set an example for all who would call on his name. Solomon built a temple. All we need to do is be obedient to his word, pray regularly, and tell others about what he's done for us through Jesus Christ. I hope, or rather, Solomon dedicates the temple. I hope you've gained at least one thought from this lesson. May God bless you, and may he ever keep you.